Hi there everyone, welcome to the first video for week 10. For this week we're going to talk about John Locke's Empiricism. And as I mentioned last week, this is really going to involve a shift in orientation for our class. If the philosophers that we've discussed up to this point have for the most part been rationalist philosophers, which means that they think that the most important and fundamental truths about the universe you discover through pure reason. So these figures were enamored really with the development of a modern scientific perspective, and for them what is really most interesting or most important or something like that for establishing this perspective is to get a mathematically precise vision of what the universe is like. So the rationalists tend to think that the most important dimension of modern scientific thinking is the mathematization of nature. Galileo, I believe, expressed this idea that mathematics is the language of nature. So, if you want to understand nature, then that simply means studying and understanding mathematics. And in the same way that we can move from a non-mathematically precise form of knowledge to a mathematically precise form of knowledge, so too the early modernists really do believe that this clarification can happen for all different kinds of knowledge if we only had different capacities, right? And so this is why they make frequent reference to God. It's because they're like, well, God would perceive things metaphysically the way that they are, not just the way that they appear to you or me, but the way that they have to be. And so there was this belief that really attaining a modern scientific perspective simply amounted to having a God's eye view on natural reality. Now, for the philosophical tradition that we're going to discuss essentially for the remainder of the semester, we're going to talk about Kant at the end, and Kant marks a decisive break from empiricism. But, for the next 5 or so weeks, 6 weeks, we're going to be talking about empiricist philosophers. We're going to take on a completely different orientation towards philosophy, one that in some ways is more successful today, that there are many more philosophers that are willing to see themselves in the lineage of empiricism than rationalism in general. So we're going to try to come to an understanding, what is this orientation? What are the basic ways that questions are formulated for these kinds of philosophers? What styles of arguments are relevant for them, and what are the conclusions that they reach? What are the internal debates between the empiricists, for example, just as we looked at the internal debates between the rationalists? And so we're really going to be pursuing a way of deepening our knowledge of this period by really investigating an alternative perspective or orientation. We've kind of used this term before, empiricism. The aim of Locke's work is really to introduce a Baconian program in philosophy, and that we tend to call this empiricism. So, insofar as empiricism is sort of like a general descriptor, it just means that you think that the most important aspects of our knowledge, or the largest bulk of our knowledge, comes from sensory perceptual experiences. And so it's obvious that, given this description, you can go through the whole history of philosophy and you can clarify, you can, call a whole bunch of people empiricists. Like, in a certain way, Aristotle was importantly an empiricist, even though Aristotle, was 1500-ish years prior to the philosophers of this period. But what makes British empiricism, or, because there's a Scottish Enlightenment as well, you should really more say Anglophone empiricism. Anglophone just means English speaking. This is a specific kind of empiricism. Sometimes people call it British empiricism, which is not totally accurate. We might just call it Anglophone or UK empiricism or something like that. Excuse me. But this form of empiricism is really inflected by development in modern scientific discoveries. In particular, it is very influenced by two English scientists, namely Francis Bacon, hence the whole thing about a Baconian program in philosophy, and Isaac Newton, who was Leibniz's contemporary, and also Locke's contemporary. And essentially, these philosophers saw both Bacon and Newton as providing essentially the most justifiable model for the natural world and the most justifiable model for natural scientific investigation. And the role for philosophy, in many ways, is to catch up. And what I mean by this is that these figures tend to think that within the domain of philosophy, we are allowed to indulge in a certain kind of like pre-scientific form of thinking, mode of inquiry. That, they might call mystical or magical or, something to that effect. And that what it would mean for philosophy to sort of restore itself to be sort of like the proper accompaniment of modern science is for itself to adopt a kind of like quasi-scientific method in terms of how it investigates and understands nature. And in this way, the empiricists that we're discussing are importantly different from, figures such as Aristotle, or there are a number of Indian materialists, for example, that we would be prone to calling empiricists, but they are not tied to the specific context of this kind of, UK, British empiricism. Okay, so let's try to figure out more of what is involved with this general philosophical approach, because we've been really tied up in Descartes and Cartesian ways of thinking for quite a while, and this approach seeks to make a complete break, in essence, with this way of doing philosophy. So if Descartes started over, Locke essentially says, okay, we have to start over again. Okay, so as I said up here, the aim is to introduce a Baconian program of philosophy, and that we tend to call this empiricism. And for the remainder of the video, we're going to focus on these three little columns that I've written in the second half of the whiteboard. We're going to try to answer the question, what is a Baconian program? Then give a general picture of Locke's empiricist account of knowledge. And then finally, discuss Locke's critique of the hypothesis of innate ideas, which he locates primarily in Descartes, but he believes would apply to all of the rationalist philosophers that we've discussed up to this point. Okay, let's begin with the first column. So what is a Baconian program? So Francis Bacon is regularly attributed with, the development of a scientific method is regularly attributed to Francis Bacon. And this is primarily because of the little selection that I've had you read for this week from Bacon's writing. In that, essentially what Bacon claims is that all genuinely scientific advancement takes place through empirical confirmation. What does he mean by this? Well, he means that if we want to be able to discover and elaborate, nature or something like that, if we want to be able to know and understand the natural world, the primary way that we're going to do that is by going out into the world and experimenting and investigating. It's not going to be primarily through like changing our concept of God or something like that, which you might read as being like a suggestion from the rationalist tradition. Bacon is, in essence, going to say no to all of that. That's not actually how you learn about the world. It's not through getting these more sophisticated, more complex models or something like that you primarily come to know the world. It's actually by getting data and aggregating data and comparing it against each other, right? And so importantly, Bacon wants to distinguish scientific reasoning from a kind of religious or mystical reasoning. I've written the scientific reasoning in this blue color, and even though I didn't have the room to label it, I wrote, I drew a diagram for religious reasoning in green below the blue. And so what characterizes scientific reasoning for Bacon is that you learn particular facts about the world, right? You go and you see and investigate and you see particular things. You go out and you're like, oh, I saw 13 rabbits, in this kilometer of forest land or something like that, right? And then, Bacon thinks it's like through the accumulation of this data, through, comparing it against what other people have found and so on, you make an inference to a sort of general or universal thesis, right? So, like maybe your discovery about the number of rabbits in a certain amount of forest land can lead you to certain conclusions about, whether or not they're an invasive species or something like that, right? And so something that characterizes this kind of inference from a particular to kind of a generalization is that these are always provisional, which means that you can always change your hypothesis, right? You can get different kinds of evidence that in some way disconfirm the conclusion that you reach, right? And so, if you go deeper into so whatever terrain and you find different data about the number of rabbits in the forest land, then you can conclude opposite of what you concluded before. And so for Bacon, genuinely scientific reasoning, it works by aggregating facts, right? You get more and more data, more and more facts together, and then you can use that data to confirm and disconfirm hypotheses, to compare data sets against one another, right? And so on. And this is really the core or essence of what it means to be engaged in scientific reasoning. By contrast, non-scientific religious reasoning often tries to make a direct inference from a universal thesis to a particular, right? And here we can decide to pick on Leibniz, right? You might say like, well, Leibniz held as this big universal metaphysical principle that we live in the best of all possible worlds. So I can infer from that for any particular thing that happens that, well, it was the best thing that could have happened because we live in the best of all possible worlds, right? And even if you got rid of the Leibnizian framework, you could do this too. You could be like, hypothesis, the world is a sphere and the world is at the center of the universe. Why is that true? Well, because God created the universe for human beings, right? What's wrong in both of these cases is the inference from what we imagine to be a totally certain metaphysical truth about reality in general, and then we think we could just apply that dogma to particular cases. But for Bacon, this is essentially illegitimate, right? We make all sorts of mistakes whenever we reason in this way. And even Spinoza, for example, is someone who I think could acknowledge this because, I think that Spinoza would be apt to characterize this as a kind of wishful thinking, right? And so you really want to get rid of these sorts of explanations that, begin with the big metaphysical thesis and then, the examination of the world that we actually live in comes later. To the contrary, you should build up your metaphysical picture of reality from the best data that is available to you. And so this is Locke's general sort of like Baconian program in philosophy, is that we need to make philosophy genuinely scientific by reasoning in ways that are appropriate to a kind of scientific inquiry and refusing to engage in a kind of reasoning that these thinkers would tend to say, belongs in the past, let's say. Okay. So Locke's empiricism is really defined by the claim that all of our knowledge stems either from sensation or reflection. I should write something else here too. Okay, so sensation, this is just, our normal experience. We see things from outside the world. I see a marker, I form a representation of it, and that's one way that I can get knowledge, is I can accumulate these sorts of experiences and test them against one another, right? And then the other thing that I can do is, well, I can reflect on, what I've sensed, right? So it's not only the case that I go out and I sense things, but in the case of, say, optical illusions, for example, I have the ability to reflect on my sensations and then be like, is that really true? Is it really true that, like, whenever I put a pen or a marker in a cup of glass or a glass of water and it appears to be bent, is it really bent, right? Locke also thinks that whenever we reflect on our sensations, we get certain concepts like number, if I had like 3 really big events happen to me that day and I reflect on it, well, I'm able to get the concept 3. And so what's important to this framework is that there are no innate ideas, or to frame this another way, that we are a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. What does that mean? Well, Descartes had this view that God had stamped in our soul, like a signet, all of our innate ideas. So, like, all the truths of mathematics, everything Descartes would say is an innate idea or a primary truth or something like that is stamped in us from the beginning of time. It doesn't come from sensation, right? You don't just get it from reflecting on your sensations. Instead, you get it through, like, maybe reflecting on yourself or something like that. And so Locke is only willing to admit 2 sources of knowledge: sensation, which comes from outside, right? And then reflection, which is just a reflection on contents or materials or something like that that come from the outside, right? And so there's nothing for us to find or something like that within ourselves. Like, Descartes thinks that you can find the truths of metaphysics just by, like, sitting down and, like, peering into your own soul in a way and finding the signet, that God impressed on you or something like that. In Locke's empiricist program, is really to say, no, there is nothing like that. There is nothing like this sort of weird introspective activity that Descartes describes where you can learn important things about the world just by like sitting on your armchair in front of a fireplace, right? This goes against the spirit of the Baconian program that Locke sees as really foundational to his approach. So instead of thinking that we can discover all of the most important ideas by like sitting in a chair and twiddling our thumbs or whatever, right? Locke thinks the way that you should discover genuine truths about the world is by going out into the world and experiencing it, right? Not staying like Descartes did, huddled up in a room with a fireplace and thinking, right? What is all that thinking gonna do for you? That's sort of Locke's general attitude. It's like you can't, there's no material for you to work on, right? All you can do is reflect on the things that you've sensed and sense things. That's it. You know, you are essentially only getting into verbal and linguistic kinds of confusion when you're like Descartes or Spinoza or Leibniz and you think that you can sort of arrive at metaphysical truths purely through thinking about it hard enough, right? That's the view that Locke finds incredibly suspect and one that he kind of wants to put to the test. And really, this critique of the notion of innate ideas, this is the foundation for the empiricist tradition, is that you get a decisive rejection of a certain approach, a certain way of thinking about and doing philosophy in favor of a different approach that is inspired by the natural sciences. And everyone, even when they disagree with Locke, genuinely or generally wants to advance this kind of empiricist program. And that's what makes someone an empiricist. And so we're going to see Locke has very particular views, about his empiricism that other people disagree with, but he lays the foundation of empiricism specifically in this claim that there are no innate ideas, that there is no source of knowledge that is independent radically of sensation, right? Because reflection is dependent on sensation too. So sensation is the ultimate source of all of our knowledge about the world. So how could Locke prove this, right? One way that you could go, that would be the way that like rationalists that we've read have gone so far in sort of refuting or evaluating this thesis, would be to say, does it lead to like a contradiction? Is it thinkable? All of these sorts of questions. That's how the rationalist would put it, right? But Locke's investigation is very different. Instead of that sort of approach, he instead treats the question of innate ideas as an empirical hypothesis. So in other words, instead of asking like, is there a contradiction or something like that in the notion of innate ideas, instead Locke says, well, what would the world look like if the hypothesis were true? And is there disconfirming evidence that exists in the world right now for this thesis? And Locke says, yes, there's all sorts of disconfirming evidence for this hypothesis. There's evidence, in fact, for the contrary hypothesis, that we are not, pressed like a signet with all of this kind of knowledge that's just in our soul. Instead, we are a blank slate that reflects the world around us that we, arrive at and interact with in our sensation. So he takes the question of innate ideas as an empirical hypothesis, and he points to various sort of like contravening evidence in favor of an alternative view, evidence in favor of this tabula rasa view and against the Cartesian innate idea view. And these are disagreement, ignorance, children, and dreams. This might, for the rationalist, these are all very scary things. The rationalist does not like any of these things at all, right? Okay, why? Well, disagreements. If we were really sort of like stamped with this knowledge that's completely necessary into the very essence of our souls, we would expect there to be no disagreement about this stuff, right? It should be what is most certain to us. But, you know, as we can see through the nature of metaphysical controversy, in fact, we have been unable to purge this disagreement. It's not been like every rationalist thought, where it's like, oh, I finally figured out, all of our innate ideas, and I'm going to write a big book where I say what they all are, and then everyone will agree with me, right? No, that's never happened. To the contrary, even the ideas that the rationalists say are the most innate and the most certain and the most universal are in fact truths about which there are tremendous disagreement, not only from Locke and his own contemporaries, but he points out the fact that, most of these rationalist philosophers think that God is one of these innate ideas, and Locke's like, well, there's all sorts of atheists and people that never heard of God, and if it was really printed in their soul, you would expect them to know, right? Similarly, ignorance, right? In this case, it's not only just that people disagree about this stuff, but also that it's not obvious that we should talk about it at all. The vast majority of human history and civilization has largely been unconcerned with the sort of questions that the rationalists pose. The rationalists are able to pose them at a particular time for a particular reason. And also, like, if the innate ideas hypothesis were true, you would expect like children to like be the best at this kind of knowledge, right? Because they are they've been affected by sensation the least, right? They have taken in less, sort of like garbled junk from their imagination, and all they have is their soul, right? So they should be able to read it really well. The things that Leibniz calls primary truths, if they were really primary, it should be like what children know before anything else. But it's so obvious that that's not what happens. To the contrary, only weirdo philosophers are concerned with these questions, right? And then finally, dreams, right? And here we see the return of a kind of Cartesian problem. Locke says, Descartes must be wrong that the essence of a human being is thinking, because we enter into long periods where we don't think, namely whenever we engage in a kind of dreamless sleep. And what these cases demonstrate is that these innate ideas that are supposed to regulate everything aren't present in dreams. In dreams, we imagine contradictory things. Things are not related to one another. There's no principle of sufficient reason or something like that in our dreams, right? At least that's how things appear to Locke. And so Locke says that these provide contravening evidence against the hypothesis of innate ideas. And they also constitute evidence for his tabula rasa treatment. Why? Because he's so able to account for these things. Why is there disagreement? Well, because all of our knowledge comes from the outside, and some of the data contradicts themselves, and so it naturally lends towards disagreement. Why is there ignorance? Well, because ultimately all genuine forms of knowledge come from experience. So ignorance is in fact the natural state that you ought to expect instead of some weird exceptional circumstance. Similarly, Locke thinks that he has a better account of what it means to raise a child. Children don't start out by learning all the truths of mathematics or something like that and then proceed to less certain truths. That's how the rationalists make it seem. Instead, children learn through seeing stuff, through interacting with their environment, through perceiving the world. And it's in fact the things that they perceive the most that they're most likely to have the most knowledge about, right? And then finally, dreams, if you think that all of the data for dreams sort of like comes from the outside, then it's easy to, understand why dreams don't really make any sense. Is because your mind is just sort of like combining information that you've received from outside and it doesn't have any order or way to do it. So Locke thinks that these 4 items, and there are actually more, you could divide this up into even finer categories, right? But these are just some evidence that Locke sees as evidence for his thesis and evidence against the rationalist thesis. In the next video, we're going to kind of essentially cover a rationalist for the last time. Leibniz actually was a contemporary of Locke's, and he actually wrote a whole book in response to Locke. And so it's a really fascinating place because it's one of the only places where you see an empiricist and a rationalist like really engaging in a debate together. And since we're going to be talking about the empiricists essentially for the rest of the term, and they're going to be bad mouthing the rationalists the entire time, I figured I would at least offer the rationalists one opportunity to respond. So that'll be the next video. I hope you enjoyed this video. I look forward to hearing what you think about empiricism. Thanks.